by way of introduction, just tell you how I met these people. I met Gar Alperovitz, who's sitting in the middle here, a couple of years ago. The first, I'm going to talk about how I met these people, but really what I'm going to talk about is when these people became whole people to me. I knew who all of these people were before I met them. I read things that they wrote. I heard about how great they were. But there's something that happens when you share space with one another, when you get to turn an email relationship into a Facebook. And for me with Gar was at the Bard College conference that then the New Economics Institute did a couple of years ago, when he spoke very beautifully about what it means to commit yourself to this work. And that actually what we're thinking about when we're sitting in these rooms and talking about what it means to commit yourself is decades of your life and really your whole life. And that's something that's stuck with me as a young person really ever since I heard that. And so I'm really grateful to Gar for being here. Gopal became a whole human California at his beautiful home. Gopal, I hope, will tell you a little bit more later on about his home, which is called The Orchard. And there are 9 adults and 8 kids and a bunch of chickens, and also a space, an incredible movement space for having conversations about the work that we all want to do together. And this particular conversation, you may have heard bits of, even just in the last session, was about how do we think about the incredible momentum behind the divestment movement. How do we think about moving into community reinvestment in a just transition? And we'll hear a little bit about that in a bit. And then Adrienne, I met the most recently. Adrienne and I just met and bonded kind of a lot in Eastern Kentucky at a gathering that Jahan spoke about at the beginning of this weekend, which was another gathering for grassroots organizations and national movement organizations and movement support organizations to really talk about where we are in planning a just transition and what it will take to get us there. And Adrienne beautifully facilitated that gathering. And it's something that's been on my mind a lot ever since. And so we're really, really lucky to have all of them here with us. We're going to start with just a small question, and I'm going to ask them to go down the line in answering it, which is, after being here for whatever you've been here for this weekend and hearing about the conversations that have been happening, where does this all go? Where are we going, and what does it mean? Small question. Gopal.
Great, thank you. And joined by my friends and comrades. Before I start, I wanted to just say a couple of things. First, I've been looking for the right moment to raise this in the different spaces that I've been in, and this is obviously the best moment because everybody's here. A deep sister, friend, comrade, mystic, healer, revolutionary from Detroit, Charity Hicks, was at the Left Forum a couple weeks ago, and she was hit by a car, and is in serious condition, very serious condition, and she is the spirit of the new economy and the old economy upon which it is derived. She would most likely have been here and rocked your world and blown your mind with her just incredible power. And as a movement comrade, she is one of those people who has devoted her life to the movement in such a way that she doesn't even have the health care that she needs, the resources she needs to get the health support that she needs and for her family to be taken care of. So first, I want to invoke the spirit of Charity Charity Hicks into the space as a revolutionary black woman in Detroit who is fighting for the soul of that city and for Mother Earth. And also, Adrienne and I are both going to make the pitch that, that we figure out a way to pass the hat and encourage people also to go to East Michigan Environmental Action Coalition and make a donation directly to support her and her family in this incredible time of need. That is... If the new economy does not involve that kind of solidarity, it is the old economy. And so we want to just lead with that. We started with Ed Whitfield and a panel that included Jahan Giron from Black Mesa Water Coalition, Christine Cordero from Pittsburgh, California, Deirdre Smith, who's working on the reinvestment work with communities. It's not an accident that racial justice and social justice and bridging from alternatives to movement building has been central in so many workshops and in so many spaces. It's not an accident that, that folks of color had a space to get together and strategize about how our vision of economy rooted in our ancestry is key to moving this forward. That is because of the hard work of the NEC staff to help us imagine together where we are going. And if you didn't notice that we are very prominently featured disproportionately to our participation in the conference, you're not paying attention, right? So I think that's an important part of the transition. I'll just quickly say some thoughts about where I think we're going. So transition, one of the things that we say at Movement Generation is that transition is the process of navigating contradictions. It would be really great if it was like, we have our vision and now we're just gonna live that. Now, to live that from where we are requires that we navigate a lot of contradictions. Sometimes people think we mean that, oh, everybody's going to have contradictions, so that's okay. That's not what we mean. We mean you need to have a clear moral compass of where you're going, and you need to be willing to try things that are hard, make difficult decisions, and figure out your way through them, and navigate your way to the vision. It is not like, oh, that's a contradiction, so that's okay, I just did it. And so I was just saying, one of my parenting principles is, we're all better than the worst things we say or do, and there's always a right thing to do next. So for my kids, you know, it's like, stuff happens, but what's the right thing to do next? And so for us, that's the process. So I really love that there's an incredible diversity in the new economy space here at this conference. I want to be in conversations with people who are trying to figure out what transition looks like in business and in all these different sectors. But what we're missing is a shared moral compass about where we're going at this point. We think we got it, and we're getting there, but we haven't landed it yet. And that requires us organizing ourselves. And organizing ourselves requires us having positions and advocating for them and engaging with each other and playing at the edges of our understandings to be able to do that. So I didn't just come here to be in a room with a bunch of people who think like me. I came here to organize around the core values of the economy that we need, an economy for life, one based on our ancestries and our histories, one that centers racial, economic, social justice, one that's determined to eradicate finance, capital extraction and accumulation. Right. I came with a set of principles around which I want to organize, and I'm looking for folks who want to organize with me, and I'm looking to convince and co-organize with folks who don't agree with me and play at those edges. So not in a like my way or the highway, but in a what do I need to do to build together? So that's that's my time, sorry. Sorry. I just want to empower everyone to just straight up cut me off. Yeah.
I'm that horrible thing they call a millennial, so I'm allowed to flash my phone when it's time, so you'll see me do that a little bit.
Sorry. No, it's okay. Great. Sorry, everyone.
All right.
There is a, is this on? There is a way for me to try to grasp what is happening. Attempt, and I underline the word try. 2 years ago, there were half as many people. That there was a new economy movement was a fragment in somebody's imagination for some of us and for some of you. Now the word has spread, and there is a word that somehow means something. What it means, we're trying to define. But what is critical, and this is the point I would start with, is that we are in the midst of a historical evolution. We are in the midst of the development of a shared consciousness. And it is to be noticed and understood that ideas and actions are shifting in dramatic and historical ways that allow us to think, where might we be over the next decade? Where might we go if we were serious? If we were serious about transforming the most powerful corporate capitalist system in the history of the world, if we understood that that was in fact what it's about, and that we were going to do that. Now, I am talking to the person sitting in your seat and mine, and the question becomes not only how you change the system, but how we engage existentially ourselves. It cannot be done without actually looking in the mirror tomorrow morning or today with the friend next to you and saying, am I up to that? Transforming an entire system. Yes, but ask it deep. Don't worry ask it to yourself first. Ask it in a serious way, in the way that some of the people that have just been mentioned have asked it. My heroes in this work, and I think they give us a model of how to think about this, maybe. My heroes in this work are civil rights workers in Mississippi in 1930. People when there was no possibility of transforming the most powerful repressive system in the United States. They would kill you after they tortured you. And they still persisted and laid groundwork for what ultimately became the civil rights triumph 100 years later than the Civil War. The name of the game, if we are not only trying to build a movement, and if we are not only trying to build a new economy, but if we are seriously interested in transforming the most powerful capitalist corporate system in the history of the world, are we willing to put 1, 2, 3 decades on the table? The chips for playing this game are decades of your life. And so the first question I would pose, not rhetorically, it's about looking in the mirror. Is that what I'm up to? I think there are a lot of people in this room who are up to that, and I think there are more people beginning to realize that that is in fact what we're talking about, and that it takes movement building, it takes commitment, it takes losing battles and rising again, and it takes ideas. And I want to highlight that. We have often not thought about what it is. If you don't like corporate capitalism and you don't want state socialism, what do you want? And if you don't know, What are you talking about? It is incumbent upon us. Bob used the term, we haven't yet defined the cathedral, in his opening to Bob Massey. How do we begin to engage the system question and define not only the elements that are building, worker co-ops, land trusts, ecologically important in every range, but what does it look like when you put it together that is actually functional and better in the most powerful advanced system in the history of the world? Not just projects. I am very interested in projects. We cannot move forward without projects. But if we become stuck in projectism, my project is the project, we cannot make it. So my hope, and I am profoundly encouraged by what I see happening, is that we will in fact overcome, and that we have in us what those people in Mississippi had in them so many years ago.
Hi. I just want to thank you. I see the donations pouring in for Charity. Charity has been a co-worker and comrade of mine in Detroit, and she needs not just our resources, but also if you do kind of spiritual work and you send energy, she needs help, all kinds of help coming back here. And I haven't really been able to think straight since I saw her. It's been really impactful, right? You need to make sure you're living the life you want to be living every single day, and treating people the way you want to be treating them every single day. Nothing's promised. So for that reason, and also because I'm completely intimidated by Gopal and Gar, I prepared my comments, and I'm going to share them with you. Oh, the other thing I want to say is, if you don't have cash with you now, you can go to www.emeac.org, and you can donate there for charity. Just put her name in the tagline. So my vision for the future and where this all leads is changing how we operate more clearly than seeing what it looks like. I see a how where we are all much more comfortable with change and with our personal power to change the conditions that we live in. Some people are very comfortable believing in heaven, in socialism, or in someone else's thinking. That's never worked for me. I learn experientially, and so far I'm only convinced that change is divine and change is constant. Octavia Butler, the Black science fiction writer we opened with, is my muse and the person I've been studying a lot. And she said, belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing. In her 12 novels, she created case studies for people like me on how we lead inside of change, how we shape change. I've been calling what I learned from her work emergent strategy. Based on the science of emergence, it's about how are we relational, adaptive, fractal, and interdependent, decentralized, and transformative in every interaction, and then at the level of our community, and then at the level of our society. I'm applying it in my facilitation and my organizational development work, and I'm noticing it actually unleashes the power of every single person in the room, rather than creating the charismatic leaders and the followers. Some people are comfortable deferring the work of vision to others, and some are comfortable being a visionary talker. I'm guilty of this. For years, I've been visionary talking all over the place. Forgive me. But I think, and I've been gathering proof in science fiction writing workshops and other spaces, that we each have important pieces. So I gather my work on how do we generate the practice of vision, the practice of building our muscle to look forward together. One major emerging lesson for me, we have to create futures in which everyone doesn't have to be the same kind of person. That's the problem with most utopias. It becomes mono-value, a new green local monoculture where everyone gardens and plays the lute and no one travels. And I don't want to go there. Compelling futures have to have more justice, Yes, and a right relationship to the planet, but also allow for all of our growth and our innovation, the interdependence of lots of different kinds of people with lots of belief systems and a continued evolution. Right now, we don't know what's right so much as we know what's wrong and what we've tried. And based on how constantly surprised I still am at my life at the age of 35, I suspect likely will continue to be this way, not knowing, but hopefully perpetually interested in resolving these issues. My mentor, Grace Lee Boggs, is still curious about how we resolve these things on the eve of her 99th birthday. So I'm hopeful. Nothing that has existed so far was the right way for everyone. But there are pieces out there and we can begin to imagine together. This is why Gar's writing speaks to me. What is between capitalism and socialism? Many, many, many paths. How do we allow all of those? This is why Gopal's work appeals to me. What are the strategies we need to learn? What appropriate fear and wonder do we need to balance to move into the right relationship? Let's learn. So I want a vision where we are curious, interested, visionary, and adaptive, and everyone gets to do that.
Thank you. Yeah. Can you hear me? Oh, great. Cool. Excellent. Thank you all for those responses. I want to talk a little bit, dig into what the actual work feels like. And we've talked about this. Gar talked a little bit about prehistory. We've been talking a lot about transition. All of those things sort of presence a vision. They don't explicitly refer to it, but suggest that there is a vision. And often we find that there's a lot of purity in that vision. Right? There's this mythical end point, and it's very pure, and we know exactly what it looks like. And I wonder, and we've all talked about this a bit, if you could talk a little bit about what those moments of transition feel like. What are the things that we tolerate in transition that we don't tolerate in our vision? What's the difference between these moments of transition and the journey and our vision? And I want to start, if it's all right, with Gar.
I was thinking. What I was thinking about was the development of steelworkers in Youngstown, Ohio in 1977. Some of you may know this story. A big steel mill collapsed, 5,000 people thrown out of work. There was no hope. Steelworkers, some of them went to the garage and shot themselves. And they saw no way forward. And then it dawned on one of them, why don't we take over the damn mill? And why don't we get the religious coalition to support us? And why don't we build this thing ourselves and build the politics of it? And why don't we put pressure? And why don't we organize? And they did. And they forced out of agony imagination of what to do with a gigantic steel mill. And they forced the administration at that time, the Carter administration, to support them. They forced the national religious community. They taught the newspapers, and they taught other organizers you could do this. One of whom I was recently told was hired in Chicago to do this in Chicago, called Barack Obama. Oddly enough, didn't happen in Chicago. They ultimately lost the battle, partly because the corporations blocked them, partly because the big steel union blocked them. It has now changed. But they understood they were laying groundwork both for a new idea in the transition, even when they failed, and that you could build a vision not only of small scale but of large scale that reflected very different values. And in places like Ohio, you now see 30 years later, the development of a nonprofit to help worker co-ops, complex co-ops in the city of Cleveland that many of you know about, ideas that have percolated. And they saw that even failure could be part of the transition if the vision was developed and if you understood the name of the game was to win and lose and then keep fighting, building towards not only small scale, but how do we transition large scale on these principles. So it is an agonizing struggle, but it is a beautiful and transformative and full of both politics and commitment and existential reality and ideas about where we need to go. So that comes to mind when I think about this question.
Great. Thank you so much. Adrienne, do you have some thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Detroit, so I think the first thing is we have to be able to tolerate letting go of the successful feelings that accompanied some people's experience of capitalism. And that's actually much, much harder. You know, I think it's easy to romanticize if you're living in a city where people still get, you know, healthcare and get paid to do work. But if you're living in a city where the majority of people don't, then it's like, how do you tolerate that moment where people are losing hope in vision, you know? So I think that's just one piece. Gopal convinced me years ago that we needed to have a level of dystopian consideration, right? Certain climate realities, for instance, were no longer wild imaginings. They're already happening to a lot of people, and they're definitely coming. I watch Game of Thrones, and like, winter is coming, you know, and I feel like I've grown up in a movement where it's like, you know, the crisis is coming, and now I live in a place where it's like, no, the crisis is here, and we have to consider going through dystopia to get to anything else. We won't be able to get around it anymore, right? So Octavia Butler appeals to me because I feel like she wants to prepare us for those inevitable consequences of our human behavior so far. And what it leads me to is a bunch of questions. Like, I answer this question with a bunch of questions, and I wrote down some of my questions. So if change is coming, what do we need to imagine to prepare for it? And I feel like Hollywood is actually kind of lined up with us. They're like, here, imagine this crisis, imagine that crisis, imagine Godzilla, just imagine, you know. It's like, okay, Hollywood, like, you're getting us comfortable with some of this crap, but I don't think it's gonna look so drastic. You know, it's gonna look like you're looking at your neighbor. They don't have enough. You have barely enough. What do you imagine in that scenario? How do you imagine showing up? What is actually compelling about surviving climate change? That's a major question for me. Like, I feel like we put it out there, like, of course we want to survive. But I look at some of these futures, I'm like, I don't know if I want to be in that. You know, how do we create a compelling future beyond climate change for folks? What is a just transition economy? And I've been thinking about, what is an economy for a phase of transition that would work for us living on a watered earth or a frozen earth? Like, how do we actually trade with each other? How do we actually engage with each other in those situations? How do we prepare not just for suffering, but for sharing and innovation? How do we acculturate ourselves, not just for individualism, but for collectivism? How do we resource local work and still honor our nomadic tendencies, the migration patterns of all humans that have existed since the beginning of time, which we are unnaturally trying to fight against by sitting ourselves in one place? How do we prepare the children in our lives to be visionary and to love nature even when the changes are frightening and incomprehensible? How do we learn to be abundant when what we consider valuable is shifting from gold to collard greens? How do we articulate a compelling economic vision to sustain us through something that's unimaginable? I think right now we're a little egotistical, thinking we can actually imagine what's coming. I think it's beyond what we can imagine. And yet, how do we learn to stay united as things fall apart? And I think this is what we're learning in Detroit, is like, okay, for a while the foundations loved us and they poured money in, and then they're turning to something else, and we still have to love each other and stay united. And how do we experience our beauty and our humanity in every single condition? And I think we can look to places right now that are war-torn, that are suffering through this economy, to learn those lessons, that there are already people who are surviving who can teach us. Those are the questions I'm holding. And I think all of you have answers to those questions, so I'll be here afterwards just writing all the notes down, ready.
Yeah, the answer giving will occur after the plenary.
Yeah.
Gopal.
Now I get to be intimidated. So I guess I'll speak to from my perspective, some of the movement building pieces of what we need to tolerate. We absolutely need to tolerate the fact that we occupy very different locations in the existing, we are all shackled to the extractive economy. If you do not think of yourself as shackled to the extractive economy, you're living in a delusion. And the question for us is, we are all shackled in different ways, and we have to tolerate that people are trying to transition from very different places in very different ways. And so I'm willing to tolerate an enormous amount of difference in where we're coming from, so long as we are guided by shared principles about where we're trying to go. And I think I really appreciate this notion, Adrienne, of like vision. I don't actually have utopian visions. Like, I have I mean, I'm also a little short-sighted, but like, we all can only see so far. And as we head there, we get to see a little bit further. And it's like, we can, if we look too far away, what ends up happening is everybody's generally heading in that same direction. But as you get closer and closer, you realize how much further off you really are than everybody else. Like, if we want to get there together, we got to stay relatively tight to some degree, or at least be clear that we're deploying ourselves in lots of different ways to figure out some of the path. But again, guided by some shared values, some shared principles. And I fundamentally believe that those of us and those communities and all over the planet who have been on the front lines of the crisis best understand and are best positioned to help guide us. And the eradication of diversity is the eradication of the wisdom we require to make this transition. And just, am I done? I'm done. Okay. I'll save my other side thought for later.
That was a really good thought. Yeah, we liked that one. So I'm really struck by what Adrienne was saying about our nomadic lifestyles, and I think that that's something that hits home for a lot of the folks in this room. I've seen a lot of you sort of over and over again which is lovely. I love seeing you over and over again in all of these different places, but I think it begs a different conception of home and where you're from. And I'm wondering if the folks here could talk a little bit about their path and their journey to doing this work and their sense of both movement home and whole human home. So I'm going to throw it back over to Adrienne.
Well, my path, the beginning of my path is actually here. My parents are here in the audience, Jane and Jerry Brown. And my parents fell in love in the 70s in the Deep South. And if you look at them, you might be able to see that they're an interracial couple. They just are. And, they looked at each other across a library, and my dad made eyes at my mom, and she was shocked, and 3 months later they were married, right? And they're still here. They're still in love and still married. And so a big part of my path, my story, is that I come from something impossible, something that they were told was socially and politically impossible. But love made it possible. Love made it possible. And that is a guideline for my life. And many times when I have been in movement spaces where people are fighting and there's a conflict and it seems like we can't move forward and we don't have any money and we don't have any time and it's a crisis and it's urgent and there's just so many reasons why it's not going to work, I find that if we drop a little lower into the level at which love operates, it does move forward. We do find a way. Love is like the thing that makes us like water. We find that lower ground. I will say that I've done a lot of different kinds of organizing. So I started off doing harm reduction work with active drug users and sex workers and talking about how do we reduce the harms in this society. And then I did electoral work, which is trying to reduce the harms in some other way, I guess. And I was very, it's like, well, we'll just try to elect the least bad person for a little while to get us through to the next least bad person. And then I went to the Ruckus Society, which was such a liberating experience because I was like, I can stand in my whole politic here, and it's all about action. And all along the path, I was a facilitator. I facilitate social justice meetings, which means I help people who are trying to vision things or resolve conflict or have a strategic plan and all this stuff. And what I kept running into over and over again was a crisis of imagination, a crisis of vision, that all we could articulate was a really, really thoughtful, brilliant analysis of what was wrong and just how messed up it all was and the interconnection of all the bad and who was to blame for it. And usually that didn't involve us in any way. It was the bad people who were to blame for it. And if we could stop them somehow, then our vision would exist. And trying to get people to tell me something that inspired me as a facilitator, and as a facilitator, you're not supposed to throw yourself into it. So I just had to be like, okay, good. Let's try to, and then, let's try to go a little beyond our brilliant deconstruction. And I was trained, I went to college and I learned how to deconstruct things, and I wasn't trained. I didn't learn anywhere. How do you reconstruct? How do you build something that's not in competition? It's not building it to be better than someone else's thing. It's just building it because it's the best possible thing for all of us. So I think my work at this point is, I wrote this, cultivating the muscle of radical imagination needed to dream beyond fear together, right? And I think fear is a great motivator. I have definitely let it move me at times. But I'm working now with my nephew and my nieces, and when I tell them, don't go there, you're gonna get hurt, they just kind of side-eye me, right? The fear factor doesn't really change anything for them. But if I tell them, there's something much more interesting over here, we're gonna get to go climb a tree, and you can jump off of it into my arms, and if I paint some compelling vision for something other than the dangerous path, then we're all of a sudden heading in that direction. And I think we are like children in this way. So the other thing I have to mention is pleasure. Deborah Fries and I were talking about this. I'm a pleasure activist. I feel like I watch human beings always choose the path of pleasure. And when I was younger, that was sex, that was drugs, that was music. And as I get older, I watch people choose family, choose friendships. And then, there's still the people who are overworking, but eventually they'll age out of that and they'll start choosing pleasure. And I think, how do we also do that for humanity? Not just say to people, here's how terrified you should be, so let's find a different way, but how do we say, let's make justice the most pleasurable experience a human can involve themselves in? Okay?
Great. Let's head down the line. Gar?
I'm a kid from Racine, Wisconsin, a dying industrial town in the south of the state. I was a liberal Democrat. I got somebody in Wisconsin. Hey, there, yay. Of the progressive tradition, and I came up totally different route. I became a historian and a political economist academically, but I got a job in the House of Representatives with a very left-wing congressman when I was 22, something like that. So I kind of saw the inside of the mechanism from the House of, one of the 5 guys who voted against the House Un-American Activities Committee, if some of you know that reference, which was very dangerous to do in those days. So then I also I ran a Senate legislative office for the guy who started Earth Day, Gaylord Nelson. So I got some sense of what that was all about, and then I did policy planning in the State Department. So that's where I came from. One thing, they don't know what they're doing. They're not as powerful as you think they are. They walk on 2 legs. Anybody gets up in the morning, put their pants on 1 leg at a time. Sometimes people think it's impossible, maybe not, maybe so. So that's one thing to learn. I really became an activist in the anti-Vietnam War era. I was very, very intensely involved in that, and I worked some with Martin Luther King on that and on economic matters, and that's where I really got serious. But the one thing I really do want to say is, I do think you need vision, and what I draw out of that experience is we need vision, which is about values and relationships and processes and morality, but there is a different level which is systemic design. And unless we are also saying what is the system that will achieve and sustain and nurture those values, we may not actually know where we're going. So I want to say a word for ideas. And because that's a very radical thing to say in a group like this. that we need to get clear and debate what we want to do. And there's been a lot of junk about that in the past, ideological crap. But we need to get beyond that and start, if you aren't thinking that question at some point, you are not thinking about transforming the entire system. You are thinking about projects, process, and transformation, but you're not actually saying, who me, who us, change the system? Look in the mirror. Are you talking about process only and values, or are you asking that question? So I think we need to do that and get serious about it and build on the models and go forward. That's the steel workers, but the local co-ops and the environment. There's a lot of wonderful stuff that's suggesting principles that we could embody and build the next system on. So I want to say one or two other words about that, just in the way of, one, if you don't think you can do it, we may not make it. But I like to think of those farmers and kind of small-scale merchants in this state who took on the most powerful empire in the history of the world and knocked down the British Empire. I like to think about civil rights workers who could not overcome. I like to think about the fall of the Berlin Wall in the Soviet Union. None of that was possible. I like to think about the collapse of apartheid. None of that was possible. So I want to urge that we rise to the question that we're actually thinking about what would happen if over 10 years from now, the explosive power that is in some of us and all around the country ready to explode began actually 10 or 20 really doing it. Not just movement building, which is central, but actually taking it on. And I want to tell you one secret which I learned. I hope you understand we don't have an economic problem in this country. You do understand that, don't you? We don't have an economic problem? This is the wealthiest economy in the history of the world. If you divided it up evenly, there'd be $200,000 today for every family of 4. We have a political problem to deal with the most powerful economic system in the history of the world, and that's what I think we all are about.
Great. So it's interesting, though, sort of how you got here question, because I practice my politics on retelling the story of my life. Like, actually rethinking, reimagining. It's not like I'm telling fake stories about my life, but taking my political understanding and then retelling myself the story of my life from the perspective of the evolution of my thought is interesting. So I actually like the question, but I'm not going to tell you the really long story of the current way I apply my politics to the story of my life. I'm going to actually tell you about what really kind of clicked for me, the moment where things really kind of came together for me. When I graduated, I was kind of a problem teenager in a lot of ways. And when I graduated from high school, my parents sent me off to India. I grew up in the suburbs of the South Bay, a middle-class Indian family from peasant farmers. When I got to Chennai, I walked off the plane. It was Madras at the time. This was the 80s. I walked out of the airport, and I had 2 simultaneous realizations, back to back, like almost instantaneously together. And the first was, holy crap, everybody looks like me. And I had not experienced that before. And it crystallized something for me that was really like, it filled a hole in my life that I hadn't, just a realization that I had never made. It was kind of, I was a teenager, it should have been obvious, but I just thought it was like, oh my God, everybody looks like me. And then right after that, I realized everything I have is at the expense of somebody who looks exactly like me. And it sent me on a journey of like, what is the thing that ties us all together? Which sent me on the journey to like, what is the thing that ties us all together? We live on planet Earth. And I think over time we've developed our kind of ways of putting those pieces together and evolving our thinking. I don't remember the second part of the question.
I don't either.
Oh, great. Okay, then I'm gonna follow up on what those all said, what Gar and Adrienne said. Those all. people who have heard, who may have been in the workshops have heard me say this before. These are some principles of strategy for movement generation, and I think they're worth repeating. The first principle, this idea of we have to lead with vision, which Adrienne spoke beautifully to, and it's a great principle of parenting as well. I try to go there with my peeps, who themselves are quite serious revolutionaries. The first is lead with vision, and as Christine from Center for Story-Based Strategy says, people will only do what they have first imagined themselves doing in their mind. If you've ever tried to jump off a high dive, you got to see yourself doing it first. So the first principle is lead with vision. The second principle is what the hands do, the heart learns. What the hands do, the heart learns. And if we put all our labor into fighting what we don't like, we will learn to love the fight and have only longing for our vision. And that, you should know, comes off a tattoo on an incredible union organizer in the Bay who's working to shift the labor movement in a direction of this kind of radical way of thinking. So we are everywhere. The third principle, which is I think the thing that gets us to the systems thinking and gets us to the total transformation, is this thing that I said earlier. If it's the right thing to do, we have every right to do it. And what is at the heart of that is the understanding that the basis of any revolution, economic, political, social, cultural, is the assertion of rights denied or the assertion of new rights, by which existing authority either has to say, oh yeah, those are rights, you get those, you have those, or no, those rights are in the way of our power, and by that we then say, no, they are rights, and on the basis of those rights we will assert our self-determination. And communities are doing this across the country in really interesting ways, applying all three of those strategies. We see it in Detroit around water, we see it in Maine around food, we see it in communities who are facing fracking around rights of nature ordinances. And what we are missing is the opportunity to come together and have it be more coherent and add up. And that's really where the emergence, I think, is coming. I probably over.
That's fine. Great. So I only have one last question that I'm going to ask, and we're going to let some other folks ask some questions. My last question is about not just our personal stories, but about thinking about how do we shape collective story and what goes into that. And I'm going to read a quote from a project that hopefully Adrienne will talk about a little bit called Octavia's Brood that she's been working on. Whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in an exercise of speculative fiction. So we're going to go down the line and then circle back to Adrienne, who has a little closing reading before we open it up. And I just want to ask the question, you are all engaged in work of speculative fiction at a system level. And in a very grounded way, as you just spoke about from your personal stories. And so if you can talk a little bit about the importance of that.
So Octavia's Brood, yay, I'm excited to talk about this. Octavia's Brood is an anthology of original stories from social justice thinkers, organizers, and activists. And the reason we thought this was a good idea is because to us, all social justice work is science fiction. It's all speculative fiction. We're trying to create something we've never seen and bring it to pass. And when you think about the civil rights movement, showing black and white people sitting at a lunch counter together was a speculative fiction act at a certain point. Slaves having children was a speculative act at one point. You don't bring children into the world so they can be in the suffering that you're in. You bring them in with the hope of something better. So Walida Imarisha is my co-editor. Some of you might know her. She and I have been working on this for a few years, and what we found is when we first asked people to submit stories to us, everyone was like, well, I'm a serious activist. You know, I'm an organizer. I don't really write fiction. I don't do science fiction. And we got them to sort of come out of the closet as people with imagination. And all of them said, I'll try. Maybe I'll give you 5 pages. You know, we said, try for 10 pages. And when the deadline came, we got several pieces that were 30, 40, 50 pages long, and people saying, oh, this is the beginning of my novel. I had no idea that I had a science fiction novel inside of me. And we had to, you know, now edit. But it was a really beautiful practice. And so then what we've started to do is these collective science fiction writing processes, workshops, where we have folks come together and we look at what are the problems we're facing, and we localize it. What is the problem? So I've been doing a series in Detroit. What's the problem we're facing? All of our schools are closed, someone's stealing our water, and we have no jobs. So, okay, that's our problem. Now let's imagine, what are some of the heroic characters we could imagine fighting against this? And in that moment, rather than identifying one hero, we try to imagine groups and collectives of folks who are making these changes. And then we say, what are the settings that we would like to imagine? And we basically spend the first hour or so just building a world together in which conditions are actually changing, in which the conflicts are there. And then we send everyone off to write their stories and we share them. And what we find is it's actually a really useful strategy to get people, even at the ideation level, to be in collective conversation and collective practice, because so much of how we are attuned is to sit by ourselves, come up with something brilliant, and then try to pitch it, right? And maybe some of you are here like that. You're here like trying to get everyone to sign on to your thing. No, not that thing, my thing. No, not that thing, my thing. And we don't even realize that we are ideation capitalists, right? We're ideation competitors. And how do we become ideation collectivists, ideation collaborators, right? And the other piece I'll say about this systems thinking piece as it relates to this building possible worlds, there's this concept of the fractal, right? If you look all throughout our natural systems, this fractal, something at the smallest level of the pattern is what we also see at the largest level of the pattern. If you look at the seashell, you see the pattern of the galaxies, right? And I think we have to understand that as we think about systems change, that I am a system. There's multiple contradictions happening in here, and I have to figure out, how do I balance my love for having shellacked gorgeous nails with my desire to not have people doing my nails, right? How do I balance my love for traveling all the time to visit my family with my understanding of the fossil fuel crisis? I'm a contradiction, and I'm navigating those systems. And then in my personal relationship with my lover, with my friends, how do I stay in the contradictions and in good relationship? How do we share resources, right? So one of my best friends has a son who needs to be in karate classes. She can't afford that. I can afford that. That's my work to do. And not because I'm charitably giving it to her, but because that's also my kid in a way, right? So how do, in those small systems, and I think that's what we have to do, is start practicing at the most personal level what we want to see at the systemic level. And I think that's how we fractal, create the systems that shift upwards and create this whole system. The last 2 short things I'll say, we also have to ask ourselves what happens when we succeed. So I was in South Africa in January, and we want to fight. Apartheid is wrong. We want to bring it down. And for those of us who believe that apartheid is happening in Israel, Palestine as well, it's like we want to see this happen. But now in South Africa, they won, right? But then if you're there, it's still a completely racialized economy, and then so it's like we have to ask this question: well, what if we win the obvious political thing? Then what happens next? How do we actually transform these systems? And so it's like we can't just win the thing that the political system now tells us is a victory. Even what we're shaping our success as is someone else's system. But what we want to win is new practices with each other, new systems of practice. And the last thing I'll say is I had a dream this morning, and I woke up and I told Rachel about it. I got chills. I was so excited because I've been trying to think about this. In my dream, we had figured out a way to harness the rising seawaters, the rising oceans, to be our power source for almost everything we were doing. And in the dream, I got taken into some basement. and there was a wave pool, and it was just flowing, flowing, flowing against the wall. And it was a top secret project, but as I stood there, time passed, and suddenly there was a grocery store all around me, and everyone was shopping with this wave pool in the middle of it, and that was powering the grocery store and everything that was happening. And my niece was like, I'm gonna go surf while you guys pick out your food, okay? And it was amazing to me. I was like, we have to think this way, right? We have to say, like, we have to shape change. We have to figure out how to harness what's coming to us rather than trying to fear it or stop it. Anyway, so it's like, if you're a science fiction thinker, these kind of things come to you in different ways. And then now my challenge to all of you who are designers and thinkers and scientists is like, can you make that happen?
Yeah, that's brilliant, Adrienne, thank you. It's so great to have, we've been friends for a long time. This is a lot of fun. We don't get to do this that often. One of the interesting things that Movement Generation, so we're a collective, and people always want us to write things down and put things out, and it's like, everybody wants us to put like bylines on stuff, and we don't. Everything is Movement Generation, and whenever like any one of us could be, we are unique in our styles, but we are truly a collective that works together and imagines together. And one of our central principles was, and we come together from different political experiences. And our original one of our founding ideas was, we are going to let go of our political lines, and we are going to engage in a political line of inquiry together. And so we started in some ways from like scratch. And of course we read other people's stuff, but we're actually more interested in figuring it out in our own way, and then having other people like, oh yeah, somebody else said the same thing in a different way. Because we own those ideas as our own shared wisdom, collective wisdom. And there hasn't been an original thought in thousands of years, right? Like, let's just be real. And nobody thinks of anything by themselves. That's an absurdity. So we're all always, and all social movement work that is engaged in this process of speculation, speculative fiction or speculative visioning. And what I'm really interested in is the ways in which folks like Penn Lowe, who is an organizer and now a professor at Tufts University here in Boston, is convening, he has a course called Practical Visionaries, where he's using, doing that work of imagining the world that we want in a way, but with folks together in a way that's like about, okay, then how do we get there from here? Like, let's do that. Let's just make it happen. Or the kind of work that Michael Primo, right here, who's doing on futurist thinking and organizing, and bringing that sort of vision together with activists and organizers and artists and writers and theorists, and doing that kind of work together. Yeah, it's super exciting. Movement Generation, we do these epic retreats. They're like 6 days long, 3 days break, and then 3 days, and we bring organizers together, and it's grounded in ecology. And one of the things we do is we make visioning a central part. Visioning, spirit and sacredness and ancestry, a central part of our guiding ourselves. Just the T-shirt I'm wearing, which Jahan was wearing on the first day, says, power without pollution, energy without injustice. Even our slogans have to paint that picture of the vision we want. So everything we do has to embed that sort of like fantasizing about the future.
Great. Go ahead, Gar.
So I'm going to say something controversial. I think we're further along than people acknowledge, and we haven't acknowledged it. Yeah. I really mean that, and I pick up on what you talked about, fractals. I think people are developing models all over the country that suggest principles for the new society. And I think we know that. And it's not simply vision, and it's not simply practice. It is concrete institutions. And that's a difference between a vision and an institution. And we are building institutions, and we know something about what they look like, and they're democratic, and they're taking over wealth and capital, and they're community building, and they're ecologically sustainable, and they're structured and designed, and we're fiddling around with how to improve all that stuff. And I think we need to say, hey, take one deep breath and look around and say, hey, we actually are building principles in institutions which give us an idea about design. Yeah. And if we, then you ask, my big question is that you raised it, South Africa, I was going to talk about South Africa. They didn't know what to do with it when power came. Yeah. And I think we are building an idea of apply those principles. What are you going to do with when the next crisis hits, and it will hit, and General Motors goes down next time? What are you going to do with it? What's your plan? And ask yourself, certainly the banking system is going to go down. What are you going to do with it? And we are beginning to develop, public banking. We're beginning to take over credit unions. We're beginning to develop democratic principles that give us a concrete idea about what we can begin to build at the next system, just beginning. And I don't think we acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge who we are. I see power in this room. And I think we don't look in the mirror and say we are building power as well as a movement. Real power. Real power. So, look at the neighbors. You guys don't look around, and existentially, we are further along than people. We got to catch up with ourselves. So that's really important. And there will be a crisis, and the banking system will go down, and the healthcare system is going to open up to public health sectors around state by state by state. And there's 20 states introduced legislation for public banking already, and we're seeing. And there will be more crises because the system's in crisis. So, my vision, just as you said about South Africa, that it may move faster, and we aren't ready to even think about it because we've got to walk on two legs. We've got to do what we're doing and also begin to imagine very clearly, and talk to each other about it as real, not just pragmatic, so that's one thing. The other thing is my great fear is wearing my historian's hat. In the 19th century, throughout Russia, there were extraordinary peasant revolts. And they happened again and again. They exploded, and they didn't know what to do, and they were crushed. And they exploded, they got crushed, exploded. And I think it is incumbent upon us to really get a sense of this next possibility. Take the fractal idea. It's a great idea. How do we apply these principles right up to the top of the system and then move it forward in walking? I love this Chinese phrase, walk on two legs. We've got to do what we're doing, but also get clear about where we're going. Vision and the fractal of what would it mean when these crises come, and what do we got to say about that, and how do we take the next step forward? It's a very exciting, it's a really important moment in American history. We live at a time when the system is in decay, is very dangerous, but they are running out of options. And that means there's going to be something to fill that gap. And I think it's incumbent on us to really get who we are about filling that gap, really. Projects, we've got to walk on two legs, projects and development and relationship and system, and beginning to say, what does it look like? Final word, go to a website, an Institute for Policy Study, because Harry Belafonte gave a really interesting talk at the 50th anniversary of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. And what he talked about was his friendship with Martin Luther King. And King understood at a certain point, particularly after the Poor People's March ran into so much problem, he understood that it was about the system and systemic change and what he called democratic socialism, but it was about at that level. And his evolution in that regard is really instructive and inspiring as well.
Great. So this is how the next 15, 20 minutes are going to go. Adrienne has a little close for this portion. We're going to applaud for these sensational panelists, and we're going to hear a few questions from folks other than me and from the audience, and then maybe if folks up here have burning questions for one another, throw one or two of those in as well. Adrienne.
So I just wanted to bring in some words from two recent ancestors. One of them is General Baker, a Detroit activist who just passed away. He was a labor organizer for decades. And he said, you keep asking, how do we get the people here? How do we get the people here? How do we get the people here? And he said, what are you going to do when they show up? And it was just such a formative shift for me, because I'm like, we're outreaching, and it's just like, wait a second, it's that question, what are we gonna do? The other thing is I just wanna read a poem from Maya Angelou, who I think did a beautiful job in her life of blending the multitudes of kinds of people that we need to be in this work. The poet, the artist, the dancer, the activist, the traveler, the lover, and this poem's called On the Pulse of Morning. And I just want to say, when I first read it years ago, I was like, I don't get it. But then I've gone back and read it over and over again, and it feels really right for this conversation. A rock, a river, a tree, host to species long since departed, marked the mastodon, the dinosaur who left dry tokens of their sojourn here on our planet floor. Any broad alarm of their hastening doom is lost in the gloom of dust and ages. But today the rock cries out to us, clearly, forcefully, come. You may stand upon my back and face your distant destiny, but seek no haven in my shadow. I will give you no more hiding place down here. You, created only a little lower than the angels, have crouched too long in the bruising darkness, have lain too long face down in ignorance, your mouths spilling words armed for slaughter. The rock cries out, today you may stand on me, but do not hide your face. Across the wall of the world, a river sings a beautiful song. Come, rest here by my side. Each of you a bordered country, delicate and strangely made proud, yet thrusting perpetually under siege. Your armed struggles for profit have left collars of waste upon my shore, currents of debris upon my breast. And yet today I call you to my riverside. If you will study war no more, come. Clad in peace, and I will sing the songs the Creator gave to me when I and the tree and the stone were one. Before cynicism was a bloody sear across your brow, and when you yet knew, you still knew nothing. The river sings and sings on. There is a true yearning to respond to the singing river and the wise rock. So say the Asian, the Hispanic, the Jew, the African, the Native American, the Sioux, the Catholic, the Muslim, the French, the Greek, the Irish, the rabbi, the priest, the sheik, the gay, the straight, the preacher, the privileged, the homeless, the teacher. They hear. They all hear the speaking of the tree. Today, the first and last of every tree speaks to humankind. Come to me. Here beside the river, plant yourself beside me, here beside the river. Each of you, descendant of some passed on traveler, has been paid for. You gave me my first name, you Pawnee, Apache, and Seneca, you Cherokee Nation who rested with me then, forced on bloody feet, left me to the employment of other seekers, desperate for gain, starving for gold. And you, the Turk, the Swede, the German, the Scot, you, the Ashanti, the Yoruba, the Kru, bought, sold, stolen, arriving on a nightmare, praying for a dream. Here, root yourselves beside me. I am the tree planted by the river which will not be moved. I, the rock, I, the river, I, the tree, I'm yours. Your passages have been paid. Lift up your faces. You have a piercing need for this bright morning dawning for you. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, and if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Lift up your eyes, the day is breaking on you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it into the palm of your hands, mold it into the shape of your most private need, sculpt it into the image of your most public self. Lift up your hearts. Each new hour holds new chances for new beginnings. Do not be wedded forever to fear, yoked eternally to brutishness. The horizon leads forward, offering you space to place new steps of change. Here, on the pulse of this fine day, you may have the courage to look up and out upon me, the rock, the river, the tree, your country. No less to Midas than the mendicant, no less to you now than the mastodon then. Here on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look out and up into your sister's eyes, into your brother's face, your country, and say simply, very simply, with hope, good morning.
want another mic?
So we have time for just a few questions from the audience. So if folks have them, let the folks with the mics know. Put your hand up high.
Hi, I'm Lori Doherty from Salem, Oregon. I just wanted to thank Adrienne for your inspirational words and to let you know that was a great dream to have today on World Oceans Day, and there are experimental projects to harness wave power off the coast of Oregon.
Hello, everyone. My name's Lauren, and Adrienne, I have a question for you. The book that I'm most looking forward to reading is Octavia's Brood, and I was wondering, Rachel, your last question was actually the question that I was going to ask, but I was wondering about the role of generational visions in the process of co-creating this book, and which is so much more than a book, and maybe you can speak to that, and maybe if any of the other panelists want to talk about the intergenerational organizing affecting the way that you are doing the work that you're doing.
That's a great question. I'll say there's two of the, as we were developing it, we thought of what are the things that we would like to hear new stories around. And one of our initial questions was new parables. How do we create new parables? You know, Octavia offered us parables and verses, and I found myself trying to write new earthseed verses. And Walida, we were like, how do we generate new stories? And they're not new, right? There's no new stories, but new ways of framing ourselves. And so we reached out to different people, and two of the folks we reached out to are particularly steeped in intergenerational approaches. One is Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who is a sister doctor who's based in North Carolina. She's actually been leading this thing called the Black Feminist Breathing Chorus, which is a meditation, visionary meditation you can go get on. But her story is a story about an ancestor speaking to maybe 5 generations down. And it's letters going back and forth across time between them about how they did what they did. And it's incredible. Another one of our writers is Gabriel Teodros, who's a hip-hop artist based in Seattle. And I'll just say he's a prolific, he's like overachiever. We put the call out to him. He finished an entire album about the project and put it out before we got the book out. So we're all like, no, that makes us look great. But it's amazing. But his story is based in Ethiopian folklore and stories that have been passed down over time there. And because it felt so important to us to say, we're not starting any of this work. We're landing in the work, and our job is just to carry our part a little farther forward along. So yeah, it's that part's been fun. I will say, Grace Liebog, who I mentioned earlier, was talking about this in the 70s. And she had a writer, Bunyan Brandt, who came and was talking about futuring as an activity. And so we even had to it's like we're not the first people to think about using science fiction for political ends. We're just the next ones to do it, and hopefully there'll be generations of folks. You know, we can only see the horizon from where we're standing. So we want to always have people who are taking it seriously, the responsibility to see the next horizon and keep looking a little further on.
Hi. You've been talking about looking to the future, and my question is a little bit about looking to the past. I live in a very conservative part of Colorado and have found myself engaged in a lot of conversations about the Constitution and a lot of values that I'm seeing on the, say, the more right side of our political spectrum. And so my question is, I think there's opportunity here, particularly around shared values, potentially around land, around liberty, around democracy, around some of the founding principles of America. And so I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts about looking backwards as we go forwards.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's looking backwards, but I do want to say a few words about, quote, conservatives, unquote. There is I'm not talking about the ideologues who are on the radio or the Washington conservatives, but local people. So the first thing I want to say is, I have a friend who I went to high school with in Racine, Wisconsin. He is brilliant, deeply religious Catholic, and extremely conservative. And we still are friends from kindergarten. And last time I talked, so he knows my politics, I know his politics. But last time I was in Wisconsin, I talked to him and I said, what did you think of Russ Feinstein and Feingold? And I said, what did you think of him? I knew what he was going to say, right? The most liberal senator we've ever had. He said, well, I voted for Russ. I said, what? He said, I voted for Russ. He was a man of principle, and I respect that. So just 1 second. And then the same thing in Cleveland, where we're doing worker ownership of the means of production, collective ownership, big scale in Cleveland. You know about these projects, the Evergreen Project. Local businessmen, many of them who would self-define as conservatives, think that's really good. These people are working hard, they're trying to build something, they're building something in a community, they're owning things, they're taking action. It isn't seen in through the same lens. Something that is principled and practical and local that begins at that level, rather than rhetorical and abstract, we are finding people understand and can respect and do that together. So I think the problem often, I don't think we know that. And I think we often, many radicals, for instance, wouldn't talk to those people because they assume by definition they won't talk to you. It really it means getting away from the rhetoric to talk about what is really concrete. And I think you're right about land and many conservation issues. And also individual liberty is important. The left didn't really emphasize that in many ways. The socialist models lost a lot of that. The conservatives were right about the socialist model in its traditional form. It centralized power too much, and it didn't take care of what was serious about individual liberty. So our model had better be, and our vision had better be respectful of liberty and community, and both of those values can be shared with genuine conservatives rather than rhetorical Washington, rhetoric generators. So I'm open to that conversation. I think we all really should be.
Can I take a quick? Thank you. Yeah, Nina Simone said it best. Ain't nobody perfect 'cause ain't nobody free. And white people have to consume racism like other people got to consume junk food. Like it's just there. It's like it's part of the deal, right? And some of the most interesting work I think is actually happening in rural communities and very conservative white communities. For example, around the rights of nature ordinances. Who would have thought that rural white conservative communities would be passing ordinance that assert that Earth has inherent rights and that they have an obligation to stand for those rights? And why is that happening? It's yay. Why is that happening? I think it's happening for a couple of reasons. One is people are facing, it's a response to the frontline fight against things like fracking, and the fact that peak everything has created front lines everywhere. And now our job is to do the hard work of organizing folks together, right? So that's one reason. But the other reason is it does speak to a deep tradition, a deep revolutionary tradition. And I think it's easy, and I can unpack the problems with the American Revolution if I have to. Like we're not this, this isn't a founding fathers yay deal. But it is important to recognize that we draw inspiration from all of our roots and traditions. And how do we create the space for the radical inclusion that Ed talked about on day one and was so right in that, what's most important isn't that we organize people who are just like us. That's not the work we're trying to do. We're trying to create an economy in which everyone can participate, that is based on a different set of values and principles, and which is structured in such a way that the power relationships we seek are designed into the economies. I won't even say economy. The economies we need.
And the only thing I'll add on to that is there's something about looking to the past to be able to understand what's possible for the future. And I think many, many folks have spoken to that. But I also believe looking to the past humbles us to remember that we are not separate from conservatives. We are not separate from those folks. They're our families. Almost everyone I know, very few people I know, come from some radical family that's just been radical back since the beginning of time. Everyone comes from situations where some of the folks are conservative, some are radical, some are somewhere in the middle, and going back home is a major front line that we sometimes forget as organizers, right? We're like, I'm going to organize. I'm going to fly over to your town and tell your people what to do. And it's like, when was the last time you went home and talked to your conservative uncle? Two things to that point. I have a conservative uncle who, if I was to sit down and try to talk politics with him straight up, we wouldn't get too far. But when we start talking about what he's doing, he makes his own chutney from his own garden that he grows in his backyard, and he does every aspect of it. He sells it to his family and his community, and that's food justice in my definition, but I don't need to put my language on him to understand that he's practicing something that I know a lot of organizers only talk about. And so trying to go back home and say, through that lens, how can I get you to understand why everyone should have the right to have their own space to garden, right? Rather than trying to come at him like, well, food justice politics says, right? So I think going home, when I think of going to the past, I think about how do we go home and have those conversations there, and that things do change, even if it doesn't look like that. My grandfather passed away 3 years ago. It was just the anniversary of it. And we sat down a couple years before he died, and I came out to him. I wrote him a letter, and I was like, hey, I like to have sex with all different kinds of people. And he did not respond well to that because he was a Christian evangelical white man in the South. But after a few years, I was able to go down and visit and sit with him. And what I realized was his heart was open. His heart was open through a different set of belief systems than mine, but his heart was open, and actually it was one of the most important places I could have that conversation. It didn't matter if I came out to a bunch of other people who were like, me too, queer rainbows. It mattered that I came out to someone who was like, in my lifetime, I want to love you, and I want to make sure you're going to be okay. And so I just want to say, think about your families as a point of change, as a major place to do this work.
Amen. Just tiny little thing. A real old organizer once said this to me. I think it was brilliant, and it really applies to everything we've been talking about, and particularly talking to so-called conservatives and going home. He said, if what you're talking about makes sense, you ought to be able to explain it to anybody. The problem is yours, not theirs. So you better make sense in it.
Well, now we're really rolling. We could just go for another few hours, but we do want to let you all go and head on your way. So I want to give, first of all, thank you to all of you for your expression of solidarity for Charity. That's really well received, and continue to be thinking about her as you do go on your way. And secondly, I want to give one last huge thank you to these three wonderful humans.